Yeah, so recently I have been appointed to the Biden administration's White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and I'm the youngest member on that council. So my perspective is a bit different on how do we transition to a safe climate system. And the reason why I've been appointed is kind of my history in politics and kind of balancing my activism work with also advocacy. So throughout my 9th and 10th grade year, I had also worked at the DC State Board of Education, and also throughout my 11th grade year, I had an internship with the Honorable Congressman John Lewis. And from that experience, I wanted to figure out how we can continue to mobilize young people. So I started an organization called 1 Million of Us that mobilized 1 million young people across the United States to turn out to vote in the presidential election. And from that context, that those demands from over the years of working in advocacy translate directly into the work that I'm doing now at the White House. With regard to the Justice 40 initiative, where basically we're taking a whole government approach to deal with climate justice. And a lot of that is how do we make sure that climate education is in our schools and is a core subject that we're teaching students to live sustainably from their inception of how they live their lives. And secondly is how do we make sure that we aren't continuing to give away subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. When we want to talk about free markets, we have to make it fair for and renewable energy to compete with fossil fuel industry, because right now solar and wind are cheaper, but because of so many government handouts, it doesn't seem that way on the economic side. And also another demand that we have is to phase out the construction and really to halt the construction of new fossil fuel pipelines that are continuing to go through indigenous lands and are continuing to pollute their waters. That is the main concern that I'm championing in this White House administration, to make sure that when we talk about climate justice, we're talking about the equity side and also the component of education as well.
You briefly touched on this. We know that climate change is impacting minorities, low income, and indigenous communities disproportionately compared to the rest of the population. You've spent time visiting communities in areas most impacted by the climate crisis. What kinds of things have you seen in those visits that perhaps people don't necessarily think about?
From going to communities and from having that correspondence with them and understanding the perspective of like frontline communities that are facing the climate crisis, it is such a drastically different, disproportionate impact of the climate crisis that they're feeling that it doesn't even feel like the same world that we're in. Because in the case of Louisiana, like the Lower Ninth Ward, there's another community that's right next to it that after Hurricane Katrina, they got immediate economic support. But the Lower Ninth Ward to this day has homes that aren't even rebuilt. And the only disparity that can be seen is the aspect of race and economic status. And that is really when we get to the heart of the climate crisis, it really isn't just a crisis in itself, but it also sets a fire on every other slow rolling crisis like racism, like sexism, like migration and immigration, and makes them into catastrophic failures, like how we're going to see over 1 billion climate migrants if we don't do anything to stop the climate crisis right now. And right now we're seeing in the United States over 80% of coal-fired power plants placed in Black and brown communities. Like, consistent coincidence isn't coincidence. It's a system that continues to destabilize communities of color and indigenous communities that continue to put us behind in our fight for equity and equality. Every time we go out in our communities and we have to breathe in toxic pollutants, that sets us back when a pandemic arises and now we have pre-existing conditions. Like, that's how these systems continue to compound on each other. And I think when we talk about climate justice, we have to think about the fact of where were these pollutants emitted, and also where's their impact being seen today. The vast majority of natural disasters are being felt in the global South, like in the continent of Africa, like in Southeast Asia, like in South America. They have been overexploited for so many generations that now, as they're facing the climate crisis, they have no other economic opportunities left because they've already been stripped of their natural resources. They've already been stripped of their independence. They've been stripped of so much that they had, that now when we want to build our communities up to be resilient from the climate crisis, they're left with nothing. And I think that is the understanding that we have to have, is that feeling of not seeing international aid to developing countries as a handout, but as a responsibility and as reconciliation for the damage that has been done over the generations that started with colonialism. Because the climate crisis didn't just start with the idea of emitting CO2 particles in the atmosphere, but the idea of limitless extraction, whether that's nature, whether that's people, whether that's communities, whether that's anything, that ideology has to end if we want to really see the climate crisis be a thing of the past.